Login.
Because can we log in from here? Yeah.
Yes. Join without video करूँ?
Switch off the video.
Join without video?
Which video?
Oh. No, I argue that side.
When we call for like a part,
yeah, but that's
good job. You be here, right? Yeah. Yes. Request all of you to please take your seats. We'll start the event in 5 minutes. So I'll call you.
Oh, hello. Are you? Zoom पे. Okay. Hello. Mic test. Hello.
You want the mic to share if you can? बाहर अभी भी आएगा बैक से आएगा तो सही रहेगा Start the event in just a couple of minutes. You're just settling down. Request all of you to please take your seats. And also please request you to please keep your mobile phones on mute in the silent mode. Alak sir is still out. So good evening and warm greetings to all of you. I am honored to welcome you all to the second Silver Jubilee lecture by Professor Albert Park, being organized under the auspices of the Institute for Human Development Silver Jubilee Lecture Series. As you know, the topic of the lecture is Understanding the Global Distribution of Routine and Non-Routine Work. I am Priyanka Tyagi, Chief Executive Officer with Institute for Human Development, New Delhi. IHD is celebrating 25 years of its founding this year. The Silver Jubilee lecture celebrations commenced on 25th January 2023 with a lecture by Professor Hajun Chang of SOAS London. This Silver Jubilee lecture by Professor Park is a part of several lectures, conferences, and activities of the year-long IHD Silver Jubilee celebrations to be concluded in January 2024. The Chief Economic Advisor, Government of India, Dr. V. Anant Nageshwaran, was to chair the Silver Jubilee lecture. Last evening, we received a communication that he has to attend an important meeting called by the Finance Minister with visiting senior US Treasury officials at 6 p.m., which coincided with the timings of this lecture. Hence, he has regretted his absence here and has sent us good wishes for the event. And we are indeed very grateful to IHD Chairman, Professor Deepak Nayyar, former Vice Chancellor of Delhi University, and former Chief Economic Advisor, Government of India, to have agreed to chair this important lecture. It is indeed an honor, sir, to invite you to please grace the dais. We are thankful, yes, sir, kindly grace the dais. We are thankful to Professor Albert Park, Chief Economist and Director General, Economic Research and Development Department, Asian Development Bank at Manila, to have agreed to deliver this lecture. I invite you, Professor Park, to please grace the dais. Professor Alaken Sharma, Director of the Institute for Human Development, with great respect, I invite you to please join the dais. I invite Dr. Tanuka Ando, Professor at the Institute, who is also the coordinator of the IHD Center for Gender Studies. Ma'am, please come on the dais. So before we formally commence the proceedings of this event, I would like to thank all the participants for their response to this invitation to this event, for joining us here, all of you who have joined us live. As you know, this lecture is being organized in the hybrid mode. More than 500 people registered on Zoom. This event is also available on IHD's YouTube channel, that is IHD India. All of you, people who have joined us online, are welcome to place their questions through the Q&A box or message us through YouTube. Professor Alakan Sharma, Director of the Institute for Human Development, is a development economist who has made significant contributions to research in varied areas such as livelihoods, labor migration, poverty, employment, labor markets, political economy, and related issues. Professor Sharma is also the editor of Indian Journal of Labor Economics, the Quarterly Journal of Indian Society of Labor Economics, and the Indian Journal of Human Development, IHD, a journal brought out by IHD and SAGE. I invite him to give the welcome and opening remarks.
Hello.
Sir.
Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the Institute for Human Development, IHD, I extend my warm welcome to all of you for being here this evening. We are very grateful to Dr. Albert Park, Chief Economist, Asian Development Bank, to come physically to deliver this lecture under the IHD Silver Jubilee lecture series. The lecture by Dr. Park was earlier scheduled on 19th October, but on the request of Professor Nair and mine, he has rescheduled this lecture today. He was in G20 think tank meeting at Mysore, which he co-chairs on urban, and why was to fly back from Bangalore to Bangkok, in the way to Manila from Mysore, but he directly, the person as busy as him, an eminent economist with global reputation and chief economist of ADB, he's extremely busy, of course, but even then he accommodated our request and rescheduled his trip. Thanks a lot, Albert, for our consideration and favor. Friends, on this occasion, I would like to mention that IHD and I have some old connection with Albert. Jimoloni, probably she has joined online, and IHD and I and many other colleagues worked rather closely in a major project on informal employment in India and China with Albert, several Chinese colleagues, including Du Yang of Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. In that connection, Albert was just talking to me, which year it was held. Albert with other Chinese colleagues visited India, probably I don't remember, at least once, maybe twice here. And Jimol and I, some of colleagues visited China. Albert also hosted us in a meeting in Hong Kong, where he was based, and still he's on leave from there. We organized an international conference around the project findings during December 2011, in which Albert not only participated, but also guided us, helped us in organizing that event. It was a very good conference, and a lot of people were there. Among others, Richard Freeman of Harvard, late Professor Ajit Singh of Cambridge, and then Deputy Chairman of Planning Commission, Montek Singh Alubalwai here. But after that connection, Albert again, we were in touch with. Albert delivered the Radha Kamal Memorial Lecture during the 55th Annual Congress of the Indian Society of Labor Economics on my request, held in December 2013 at JNU, Jawaharlal Nehru University, on the topic towards an inclusive labor market in China and India. It was a very illuminating lecture, well delivered by Albert, and quite a big hit in the entire conference. We also published his lecture in Indian Journal of Labor Economics, March 2014. In fact, this entire project findings were published as a special issue of the Indian Journal of Labor Economics, in which Albert also contributed. Albert, we have requested and he agreed, Albert, to be in the editorial advisory board of the Indian Journal of Labor Economics, although I have not been able to take his active help, for which I am alone responsible. I am conscious of his very busy schedule. Friends, IHD established in 1998, and I should mention it was established by the Indian Society of Labor Economics in 1980. It is solely based on projects, no regular funding, but has been working on livelihood, labor employment, and human development issues. It houses Indian Society of Labor Economics. Annually, we organize Indian Society of Labor Economics. A lot of our time is devoted to the journal, society. Other journal which we published is Indian Journal of Human Development, published by SAYS for the last 15 years. Institute has a rather good network of researchers working particularly in labor and employment issues in developing countries. We have done a number of studies in comparative framework, South Africa, Brazil, other Asian countries, South Asian countries, and just now I told about, not recently on China, but with him and other colleagues in China, we did work on China also. Friends, as Priyanka mentioned, during its year-long Silver Jubilee celebration, IHD is organizing several events. IHD, Niti Aayog, IHD in collaboration with Niti Aayog, ILO and Wits University, Johannesburg, very recently organized a major international conference on new technologies and future of work in Global South, which was organized here. 35 people came from outside India. It was a major conference with Niti Aayog. It was organized. The second conference on inclusive and sustainable urban development in Global South is being organized by IHD in collaboration with University of Florida, Niti Aayog, on coming 10-12 August. The concluding Silver Jubilee conference, which we consider most important, and we are calling it Global Conclave on Advancing Human Development in the Global South. It is organized again, we have booked entire IAC, not only this year, other parts of IAC also. For that conference, we are expecting, and we are trying to get a large number of people, including Global South, of course, North. Announcement of that conference is in your folder. I request Albert to find time to come to that conference, and it will be good. ADB also associated with this conference. Friends, just Priyanka told you about Silver Lecture Series. This is the second lecture. The third lecture is being organized on 11th of this month, August, by Sunita Narayan on urban environment. A lecture by Dr. Indrameet Gill, Chief Economist of World Bank and Senior Vice President, is in October. Dr. Ashwani Seth, who is sitting here, he will be delivering a lecture in November. Mr. Deepak Nair in early December, and Kaushik Basu in January 2024. We are trying to get 2-3 more persons for this lecture, and I hope that we'll be able to do it. I won't take much of your time and obstruct the lecture by Albert on a topic very important in the contemporary discourse, both academic and policy. Albert, apart from an eminent economist, is a very powerful speaker, which you will come to know very shortly. Thanks very much, Albert, for coming here. Thanks, Professor Deepak Nair, and all of you for being here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Sharma. Now, the chairperson of this lecture is IHD Chairman Professor Deepak Nair, who is Emeritus Professor, Jawaharlal Nehru University and former Vice Chancellor, University of Delhi. Professor Nair has held several important positions both in academia and policy. He has been Distinguished University Professor of Economics at the New School for Social Research, New York, and is the chairman of Institute of Development Studies, Sussex in the UK. He's on the board of several institutions and societies. He has been the Chief Economic Advisor to Government of India. His research interests are primarily in the areas of international economics, macroeconomics, development economics, and economic history. Professor Nair has published numerous articles and several books. And Professor Albert Park is Chief Economist of the Asian Development Bank, ADB, and Director General of its Economic Research and Development Impact Department. Professor Park has more than 2 decades of experience as a development economist and is a well-known expert on the economy of the People's Republic of China. He has worked on a broad range of development issues, including poverty and inequality, intergenerational mobility, microfinance, migration and labor markets, the future of work, and foreign investment. Professor Park is Chair Professor of Economics, Social Science, and Public Policy at Hong Kong University of Science and Technology, HKUST, is currently on leave from there. He served as a founding director of HKUST's Institute for Emerging Market Studies and Center for Economic Policy, and previously held faculty positions at the University of Oxford and University of Michigan. He received his bachelor's degree in economics from Harvard University and his doctorate in applied economics from Stanford University. Sir, Professor Deepak Nair, I request you to kindly moderate this session.
Distinguished guests, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, it is my privilege to welcome you here on behalf of the Institute of Human Development. I would like to welcome especially Professor Albert Park, who made this extraordinary effort to be with us this evening, although he arrived here at 3 in the afternoon and leaves at 11 p.m. tonight. Thank you, Albert. I stand before you essentially as chair of the IHD board, and I am a new kid on the block. I have been chair of the board for about 3 months, if that, but I have been associated with the institute in one way or the other for many years. As you know, we have turned 25. It is the age of majority for individuals, just about when they begin their working life. But it is relatively young for an institution. Given that, what the IHD has been able to attain in the past 25 years is almost stunning. It's most impressive. And I think the best epithet that might describe IHD is that small is beautiful. Yet, despite its small size, it packs a big punch, quite a punch. In terms of reach, in terms of impact, in terms of creating a meeting space from people across India, across Asia, across the world, and above all, and that's a tribute to Team IHD, its ability to convene gatherings. And it's really superb at that. I will now talk to you about the series of Silver Jubilee lectures, which Alak and Priyanka have already done, about everything that we are going to do during the year 2023. I'd just like to say a few words about Albert. He is amongst the most distinguished economists in Asia and indeed in the world as a whole. Although he has studied China, he studied labor markets, he studied employment, he studied migration, I think of him as someone who understands development economics at large. He's versatile, and he's able to bridge the worlds of theory, policy, and practice with consummate ease. What is more, and I think it is important we say it here and recognize it here, he has been a friend and a well-wisher of the Indian Society of Labor Economics, with which I'm also associated, and the Institute of Human Development. We've known each other for a long time now. We meet from time to time, but I wish we were able to meet more often than we do. So it's great that you are here, Albert. I would simply like now to invite you to deliver the Silver Jubilee Lecture, the second Silver Jubilee Lecture.
If we go that side and see it, because otherwise we won't be able to see.
Thank you so much, Deepak, for those kind words. It's great to be back here at the India International Center. The first presentation I ever made in India was here at the India International Center, first place I ever stayed, I think. And it was also at Alex's invitation at the time. Deepak, I don't know if you recall, I actually met Deepak when I founded a new Institute for Emerging Market Studies at HKUST. Deepak was one of the speakers at our launch event for the whole institute. Jan Svaner, a colleague at Michigan, was also one of the speakers, and Yao Yang, the current dean of the National School of Development at Peking University, was the third. So we had a very nice balance, regional expertise. And so I was very grateful to Deepak for really making very powerful contributions to that event. So let me get right into the topic. I want to talk about the changing nature of work globally, and specifically how we should think about routine and non-routine work, which has been the focus of a lot of recent research in labor econ, in particular how technology and globalization is affecting the demand for different types of skills, and also how it's creating wage polarization, especially in advanced countries, but it's also been argued that we're seeing similar phenomena in developing countries. And these pictures, I think, show you kind of the narrative that has emerged about what has happened in the US economy on the left and in Europe on the right. And these lines look at the trends in certain characteristics of the actual job tasks that are involved in work based on labor force surveys in the US and in Europe. And you can see that the two lines that are rising over time are the non-routine skills. So non-routine analytical skills, non-routine interpersonal skills. The red and blue lines on the left figure have been going up over time, at least since the 1970s in the US. Many of it attributed, and people have shown with good empirical analysis that computers played an important role in this. And then the more routine work has declined. So you see in particular the routine cognitive tasks, the gray line has declined. The routine manual tasks has also declined. And people argue, of course, that part of this is automation and other types of technology that has in particular affected middle skill jobs in the US, which are like clerical jobs, factory jobs. And because the routine work is focused in the middle of the income distribution, it's led to a hollowing out of work at the middle of the wage distribution. And it's led to greater polarization. You have more people at high incomes and more people at low incomes. And you can see pretty good evidence of this in the patterns of growing wage polarization in the US. The right-hand side is work done for Europe. And I'm not going to really say much about it, just to say that it seems to follow the US pattern. And the question is this also what we are seeing in emerging market countries and developing countries? And there is less evidence, to be honest, about what's been happening, partly due to data limitations. And in particular, one thing that's been very peculiar about this literature is that because US Department of Labor did a very unusual exercise of, for every occupation, documenting in great detail what was involved in doing the work for that occupation. And people have used that. And so early labor economists, including David O'Toole and others, used those questions to come up with indices that I just showed you about whether the work is non-routine or routine, cognitive, interpersonal, et cetera. And they really devised those summary descriptive indicators of the nature of work or the type of work. And most other countries don't collect that kind of information. They don't really know what people do in a particular occupation. I mean, people may talk about it and have a sense of it, but they haven't collected it systematically. And therefore, the way this literature has evolved is when people study how the nature of work is changing in other countries that are not the US, they usually just assume that the task content of work is the same as in the US. And they just match the occupation codes. And so if it's a manager job in the US and it requires a lot of non-routine skills, then they just assume it's the same in Belgium or in England. But they also assume it's the same in places like India or China. And that, of course, is a much bigger leap of an assumption. And that's really the starting point of this research I want to present today. It's really a data-based exercise where we said, well, let's question this assumption about whether work in the same occupation is the same in the US as in other countries. And if we really go to survey data to directly measure what people are doing in their jobs, what can we learn about the real global distribution of routine and non-routine work? And also, what can we learn about the factors, the global powerful forces that are really determining differences across countries in the nature of work? And so what we did is in the first paper I'm going to be presenting results from is we found all of the data sets, micro data sets in the world where they were actually asked questions about what you did on the job. And the PIOC surveys from OECD were a very valuable source because they have a set of questions about what you do in your jobs. So that includes 37 countries and surveyed between 2011 to 2018 before the pandemic. But the problem with the PIOC surveys is that it's OECD, so it's all rich countries, and it's missing the emerging economies and the developing economies. The World Bank had a group that also in the early 2010s saw this gap in the literature, and they commissioned a bunch of surveys in some developing countries that were not exactly the same as PIOC, but close enough where you could measure tasks in a similar way. And so we're looking at data from 8 countries surveyed in developing countries. And then the last survey is a survey from China with the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, which I've been working on this for a long time with a guy named Du Yang, who was also part of this informal study of China and India many years ago. So a lot of old friends doing research with each other for a long time. And we decided we would include the STEP module basically in a Chinese labor force survey, which we did in 6 large Chinese cities. And so that we're using that for China. If we think about what are the factors that explain differences in tasks over time and across countries, we've focused our discussion on 4 big factors. The first is technology, which is, I think, most obvious from the literature: computers, internet, robots, etc. The second is globalization. And here, the normal theoretical idea, and there's some empirical evidence that supports it, is that routine jobs get outsourced from rich countries and insourced into poorer countries. So a place like China, for instance, will do processing a lot of using labor-intensive, very simple technologies initially to manufacture goods, export them to the world. And that was very routine work, a lot of that work. And then the third factor is structural change, that in the US, where it's been a developed country for a long time, there isn't a lot of structural change in terms of the types of things being produced in the economy at a broad level. But in rapidly growing countries, of course, we see huge changes of labor leaving agriculture into manufacturing or into services. Of course, there are now a lot of debates about deglobalization and the decline of industry, even at earlier stages of development. But definitely fast-growing countries see lots of changes, and just the changing nature of what you're producing in terms of the goods and services in the economy will certainly have an effect on the demand for skills of the workforce, and this could affect the nature of routine work or non-routine work in those economies. And the last factor is a supply side factor of skills, right? Because we know that better educated people are better able to perform non-routine cognitive tasks, which is problem solving, leadership, managing other people, et cetera. And there's huge differences in the skill distribution of workers in different countries. Okay, so we focus on these four key factors. And then I'm drawing on work from two papers, really. The first is a paper that was published last year in the World Bank Economic Review with Piotr Lewandowski and Du Yang, among other co-authors. And this is a paper where we just look at the survey data from these, I think, 47 countries and try to understand, because most countries only have 1 year of surveys in the 2010s, it's really trying to explain cross-sectionally why some countries seem to have more routine intensive work rather than less. And then in the second paper, which just came out as a chapter in an edited volume, the pictures on the right, edited by Kunal Sen at UNU Wider and Piotr and Simon, who are my co-authors on this paper. We are a bit more ambitious about really looking at the global distribution of work. We use the survey data-based results to try to predict what we think the relative routine task intensity would be in different occupations in different countries based on what we know about the country characteristics and what we've learned from these regression analysis. And with that knowledge, we can kind of project what the routine nature of work is on countries that have labor force survey data, but no direct survey data on tasks themselves. And we can also take it back in time. And we can see as the occupational distribution changes in different countries, based on what we know about how other factors in those countries have changed over time, we can make some rough predictions about the routine intensity of work in those countries. And we can actually start saying something, what's been happening over many years across the world in richer countries and poorer countries. Now, it's quite stylized. We're not trying to make strong causal kind of claims, but I think you're going to see that both the first exercise looking cross-sectionally and this exercise of trying to make some assumptions to be able to think about what's been going on globally over many years reveals a lot of very interesting new insights that I think lay the ground for maybe future research. Okay. So I'm going to not spend so much time on the technical aspects of the work and maybe focus a bit more on the results, but one thing we do to try to link the ONET measures. ONET is the name of this description of tasks that has been done in the US, to try to come up with survey-based measures that are good proxies for these commonly used ONET measures from the US. We look at the PIOC survey for the US and try to look at which questions from that survey can be used to construct indices that are highly correlated with the ONET measures across occupations. And so this is our validation exercise. So we find out the set of questions that best capture that ONET. So we're talking about the same thing, even though we're using different data. And then we apply that measure and to all of the other countries in the data. Okay. And just to give you a feeling for that, in the surveys, the questions that turn out to help us explain the occupational variation and non-routine cognitive analytical skills are whether as part of your job, you have to read news, whether you read professional journals, whether you spend at least 30 minutes solving problems in your work, and whether you do any type of programming. And we construct an index from this, and this is correlated with the ONET task. The correlation coefficient is pretty high, 0.77. And similarly, for non-routine cognitive personal tasks, there's a question about whether you spend time supervising others and whether you spend time presenting or making speeches to others. And using just these questions, this creates an index which has a 0.72 correlation coefficient with US. We have a routine cognitive measure, and the questions that turn out to have the best explanatory power is one about whether you it's easy for you to change the order of tasks in your job. Can you reverse them? And then whether you have to fill out forms, which is a very routine type of work, and the opposite of whether you have to make presentations a lot. And then finally, we have one for manual skills, which is based on a single question, because most surveys don't focus a lot on that. And we actually don't really use the manual one because it's so primitive. And we use those indices to define a measure which is going to be the focus of the work for both papers, and it's called the relative routine task intensity of work, RTI. And it's defined as the log of this routine cognitive score minus the log of the non-routine analytic and non-routine personal scores. Okay. And when we do that, this shows, I think, the 47 countries where we have survey data. If you do a simple average routine task intensity of workers in each country and plot it against GDP per capita, this is what you get, right? So it's not so surprising. It's declining, which means that richer countries generally have work that is less routine and more non-routine. Now, what's interesting is if you look at the broad occupational categories, the relationship between the routine intensity of work and GDP actually varies quite a lot. For the high-skilled jobs, the managers and the professionals, you can see that there's a very strong relationship. So it's saying that in poor countries, a manager is actually doing more routine work than a manager in a rich country. And you might ask, well, why would that be the case? And I asked that question to many other people to get their thoughts. When I was visiting Stanford, I asked Nick Bloom, he does a lot of work on managers, how he would interpret this. And he said that it could be something related to social trust, that managers in poor countries, they have to do many things to just verify things, lock up the factory, make sure nothing's being stolen, or supervising workers, whereas in maybe richer countries, managers can just focus on making decisions, right? But there could be many explanations. And what's interesting is that the middle skill occupation categories like clerical workers and factory workers, there's no clear correlation between GDP per capita and the level of the routine nature of work. So these seem to be, now there's a lot of variation across countries, but not in a way that's strongly correlated with the level of development, which suggests that the relationship, the type of work is a little bit more stable in rich countries compared to poor countries. And a lot of the action is actually in the skilled work, which is interesting. Okay, so we throw all of the data from all of the workers in all of these countries into one big regression, which is a global worker level regression model. And we do something very simple and descriptive. We regress the RTI of each worker on a number of characteristics that try to capture those four big factors we identified earlier. So technology, globalization, structural change, and skills. And so these are the specific measures we use. So for technology, in our main specification, we use computer use at the country sector level, the percentage of workers who say they use a computer in their jobs. For globalization, we use the foreign value added share, which is a popular kind of global value chain measure. And we also have a FDI measure as a share of GDP. And we also interact those with GDP per capita, because the theory tells us that for richer countries, globalization may be associated with more routine work, but for poorer countries, more globalization could be associated with more routine work. So rich countries, less routine, poor countries, more routine as they globalize. And then for structural change, we use the level of development and sector dummies to show this changing nature of employment structure. And then for supply of skills, we have the education level of workers. And what's nice about the PIOC and STEP surveys, they actually had a test instrument. So we actually have a direct measure of literacy and then demographics. Okay, so technology turns out to be important, and we allow this to be nonlinear in RTI. So the way to look at this is that, as the percentage of people in your country sector who use computers increases, initially there isn't that much change in the routine task intensity of work. But once you hit something like 40% or so, then you start to see above 40% more computer use is associated with less routine work. If we do a very simple variance decomposition exercise of TI with respect to these four fundamental factors, the data we have, we get the results here. So for all workers, technology explains the most, 39%. Then second is supply of skills, 28%. Then globalization, 8%, and structural change actually works in a negative direction. And then you can see that if we divide the workers by whether they're high-skilled, middle-skilled, or low-skilled occupations, the technology matters the most for the high-skilled occupations, not surprising, as does supply of skills for the high-skilled occupations. Globalization matters a bit more for middle-skilled and low-skilled occupations. And supply of skills does not matter much for middle and low skill occupations, but for all categories, the technology is the most important. This is explaining the cross-country variation in the average routine task intensity. Okay. And then we can do a decomposition analysis where we treat the US as kind of the frontier or the most non-routine work, and look at how the average gaps in routine task intensity between the US and different groups of countries. We divide into three groups: the low middle income countries, and then the bottom high income countries, and then the top high income countries, which are very similar to the US, and look at their difference in routine task intensity with the US and see which of the four big factors kind of explain these gaps. So the black diamonds are the gaps. So the first figure on the upper left is for all workers. And you can see that technology is still the most important. It's the dark red bar, but skill gaps are also pretty important. That's the gray area. And then globalization has modest importance. If you look separately at high skilled, middle skilled, and low skilled occupations, then globalization has the most relative importance for the low skilled workers, which I think also makes some sense. And technology is, again, most important for the high skilled workers. Okay. And then since a lot of people were interested in China, one thing that's important to note is despite its rapid development, the tasks in China are still very routine compared to the US and compared to other countries, actually. And so the black diamond is the gap between the US is the norm at 0, and China has an RTI of 0.76. And some of that gap cannot be explained by the four factors. That's the distance between the diamond and the bar. But for all workers, you see that a lot of it is still the skills gap between the US and China. So in China, the percentage of people working with college education is about 20%. In the US, it's like 40%. Computer use also is important. So there's still a big gap. 50% of people use computers in China, 75% in the US. Just to give you a flavor with a real country to country comparison. I would have done this for India, but India is not one of the countries where we have survey data. So we have to do the second exercise, which is extending, and this is moving into the second paper. So the background of this is that Kumal Sun was very interested in trying to link RTI to inequality. And so they have started this big book project on, they commissioned studies, I think in 8 different countries. And they wanted to understand how routine changes in the nature of work was affecting inequality in developing countries. And then they heard about our work and said, well, yeah, maybe your measure of routine task intensity is better than using the US ONET measures, since your work shows that that's a pretty bad assumption to use the US occupations as an assumption about what the task content of work is in other countries. So we modified our exercise to use survey data for the 46 countries to predict at the country occupation level what the typical routine task intensity would be. And then based on that, we could make some predictions from labor force survey data from other countries about what the routine task intensity of different occupations would be in each country. So it would be country specific estimate of the routine task intensity. They use that in their country studies in this volume. Okay, so I'm gonna jump through this. This is basically saying what we did. Let me go to the results. So what do we find? So again, there's a lot of stuff happening here because we're using the regressions to predict country occupation routine task intensity, and then we're going to apply that to many countries and also many years using, you know, a bunch of labor force survey data sets that are available, I think, through the World Bank. And one thing you can see is that, so we in each case here, we plot what the patterns would be if you made this ONET assumption that work was the same as in the US, and then using our country specific kind of measures of routine task intensity. And you can see for the low and lower middle income countries on the left-hand side, our measure produces a very steady routine task intensity, whereas it declines very steadily if you use the ONET measure. And for upper income too, now we're also showing a slight decline, but not as much of a steep decline as the ONET measures. The other thing notice is the gap between these lines. Our measures are always showing higher routine task intensity than the ONET measures, which reflects the fact that in developing countries, work is more routine for the same occupation than it is in richer countries. Then these are the other two groups, the bottom high income countries and the top high income countries. It's only really the top high income countries where using the US assumption is not too bad compared to the country specific, which makes sense, of course, because probably the nature of work is more similar in the US and these other richer countries, similarly rich countries. Okay, so when we allow for so we can do this in two ways in terms of changes over time. We can look cross-sectionally and estimate the routine task intensity in other countries, in each country, and then hold that constant and just see how the structure of occupation changes leads to changes in routine task intensity. Or we can also allow the routine task intensity measures themselves for each occupation to be changing at the same time as the share of workers in each occupation is also changing. And we do it both ways to try to understand what's driving the increase. And for each case, we can look at how much of the changes are being driven by between occupation differences in routine task intensity, meaning that, you know, a country has many fewer people working in this very routines, or more people working in a routine sector compared to the US. So that between occupation difference is what explains the difference. or it could be a within occupation change, meaning for the same occupation, we're just more routine than in the US. And so these are the results. For the low, middle income group, you can see that the differences in RTI are increasing over time with the rich countries. And it's about equally divided between the between occupation differences and the within occupation differences. And the within occupation differences are actually growing over time, which means that relatively speaking, the difference in routine versus non-routine work within the same occupation are growing when you compare rich and poor countries. So there is, in a spirit of globalization, I guess, a growing specialization in the world of routine work in rich countries, non-routine work in rich countries, and routine work in less developed countries. Okay, so what about India? India is one of the countries we kind of predict using this methodology. And so we pulled out the India specific numbers for this presentation. And there's 4 lines here. So 2 of them are based on ONET and 2 of them are based on our country specific RTI. And so not surprisingly, that the upper 2 are based on our country specific RTI. So we'll take those as the better estimates. And you can see again that the routine task intensity is higher than if you use the ONET measures. Also, if you look at the actual numbers here, 0.8, these are actually very high also in a cross-country sense, that the relative routine intensity of work is pretty high in India. Now, one thing you see is that starting in about 2009, you start to see, I think, a more steep decline in the routine task intensity of work. So the 2 country-specific lines on the top, the first one, the gray line or the blue line at the top is country-specific RTI, where you also allow the RTI within for each occupation to be changing over time. And the red one is where you don't allow the RTI to change over time. You only allow the structure of occupations to change over time. And they are similar, obviously, in patterns, but if you allow the RTI to change over time, you see that it's a bit of a steeper decline. And I guess in principle, that should be the best estimate, would be this top line estimate. Okay, what does this mean for thinking about the Indian labor market? I wanted to present some results from another study by Saloni Khurana and Kanika Mahajan. I don't know if any of, are they here? No. Okay. I asked Alec to invite them.
I invited them.
Yeah, well, you know. So what's interesting is we used labor force data based on assembled by the ILO basically for India on the previous slide. What they do in their paper is they look at survey data from India. So some of them are the NSS surveys, some of them are the periodic labor force surveys. And they have them for these 5 years. So it spans from 1983 to 2017. And they were the authors of this working paper, eventually became the chapter in this edited volume by Kumal Sen and others on India. And again, the dark red bars are what they find using ONET, and then the pinker bars are using basically our country specific estimate, but applied to the survey data. So different data set. And it's essentially a similar pattern. The routine task intensity is declining more slowly using our data than using the ONET data. Although here there is a difference. It actually looks like the ONET data is showing more routine task intensity than our measure, which is opposite from the other data. One thing about this paper is that the data, they're just looking at urban paid non-agricultural workers. So it's actually probably not the majority of the labor force in India. So it's people where they can really look at wage inequality. The previous figure I showed you was for all workers in all sectors, including agriculture. So the other thing that they do in this paper, which I wanted to talk about because it starts to link the findings to what's going on in the labor market, is they link it to wages, right? So how do these trends in RTI, do they at all explain changes in wage inequality? And they find or they conclude that changes in RT do not explain much of the change in wage inequality in India. And in fact, using the survey data, they present some interesting estimates of the changes in wage inequality, which I'm not even sure all of the people in the room will be aware of. They find basically that wage inequality increases from 1983 to 2004, and then 2004 to 2011, it's very flat. And then from 2011 to 2017, wage inequality actually declines pretty sharply in India. And it's characterized by also falling returns to education, also falling returns to RTI in the data, which is why they say it doesn't really explain, because the RTI continues to decrease here, which means that jobs become more non-routine over time in India, but the patterns of wage inequality kind of go up and down. So it's not really, it doesn't seem to be very related to and they do a more regression-based method to try to tease that out a bit better. So they argue that changing returns to ITI had an equalizing effect on wages, likely due to, they argue, an increased supply of skilled workers outpacing increasing demand for skilled workers. And you actually do see a very big change in the education composition of the labor force over this period. And they also think that maybe institutional factors like minimum wages, or I don't know, maybe NREGA may have had a difference, that these kind of things are pushing up wages up the lower part of the distribution. And this may also account for the falling wage inequality, but it's not RTI. Now, one kind of concern I have about the exercise here is that in general, I'm not that a big fan of putting RTI on the right-hand side of a wage equation, because unlike education, which is reasonably predetermined, RTI is basically depends on what the employer decides to tell you to do, which is being determined simultaneously with wages. It's a very endogenous thing. And they find that the differences in wages associated with differences in RTI fall. But it could be that there are many selection things that could be happening in terms of how workers of different ability are being allocated different tasks. If you wrote down a simple Roy model of job task allocation, you would find that, for instance, if there's increasing demand for non-routine tasks, it could be that I start to ask less educated workers or less ability workers to increasingly do non-routine work, right? And of course, they're not going to do it as well. And so the wage differences you see between this group and the ones not doing the non-routine work are going to look like they're shrinking, but it could just be an ability composition effect. But it's interesting. The results for India are very similar to the results for many of the case studies in this edited volume. It shows a mixed picture, that this narrative of growing the decline in routineness of work due to technology is leading to wage inequality. That's not a story you see showing up very robustly across different countries. And the stories you do see seem quite mixed and heterogeneous, because each country has other factors. You know, we put out these 4 different forces, which are all changing rapidly in developing countries. And globalization actually works in a kind of an opposite direction as in rich countries compared to poor countries. And so it becomes a bit more complicated, I think. This is a bit hard to see. So one thing in India, which I thought may help explain why we don't see a very strong association between trends in RTI and wage inequality, is that if you look at how the average wages, which is this red line, are related to the skill percentile, or where you are in the wage. I'm sorry, this is RTI. This is not wages. The red line is the RTI, I believe. I keep moving this thing to get it out of the way. Yes, right. And so you can see that. So these are just jobs ranked by their wage level. So you can see for the first half of the distribution, there isn't much relationship between the wage level and the RTI intensity. So it could be that some of the increases in, or the decreases in RTI are happening not at the lower part of the distribution, but at the middle part of the distribution. Either way, it's going to show up as changing RTI, but it's going to have very different associations with changes in inequality. One thing that you see in India is noted in the paper, and something we also found in China, and China also is another place where we do not see a hollowing out of the middle skill jobs. We actually see faster growth of middle skill jobs in China compared to high and low skill jobs. And so you don't see, again, it's counter to this typical narrative. Both countries have seen a pretty big increase in retail service sector workers in the more recent period, which tends to be a somewhat routine job, but a middle skill job. So that's pushing up wages in the middle of the wage distribution, right? So that's going to go against wage polarization, just as an example. So let me summarize and conclude. This is really a data exercise, what we've been doing in these two papers, trying to just relax this assumption that the nature of work is the same in occupations in countries outside the US as it is in the US. What we have found is that the de-routinization of labor markets in the low and middle income countries has been occurring much more slowly than appears using the ONET data, and that has been kind of argued in many narratives saying this is a global phenomenon. It isn't the same. And actually, we're seeing a divergence in routine work and non-routine work, with the gaps between the relative task intensity, routine task intensity between rich countries and poor countries growing over time. So most of the world's non-routine work is occurring in richer countries, and most of the world's routine work is occurring in poorer countries. Much work remains to unravel the complexity of how technology and global value chains affect the nature of work, wages, and inequality in low-income countries. And I really hope someone in India does a survey where they go out and ask workers about the task content of the work. So if anyone's doing a large-scale survey, let us know. One thing I'm doing at ADB in the research department is we're commissioning several new studies of countries in Asia where we're adding these types of questions to labor force surveys. And we have a plan to do it in Philippines, Georgia, and one other country I'm forgetting, to try to increase the body of knowledge to where we can start to understand, again, these more processes that are obviously more complicated than we have been assuming. Now, that said, I think this complexity shouldn't stop us from thinking kind of clearly about where the future is going in many countries, but including places like India, and what the government priorities should be. So if you think about these forces that are occurring, obviously, it's always going to be a good strategy to invest in skills of the labor force, because that is going to affect the opportunities and the inequality if more people have less education. And this is driving some of the patterns we're seeing in the world, including Latin America. Then the one area that is, I think, most comfortable is about technology, right? Should we be trying to, as policymakers, doing something about the nature of technology change? And I've been part of different forum where this is discussed, and I think there's disagreement. Some people feel it's a very hard thing to control, right? But I think, Darren Acemoglu has been very outspoken on this topic too. And one thing he argues is that which I think makes sense, is at the very least, let's not distort factor prices in the wrong direction. Meaning, let's not make capital very cheap and labor very expensive because of policy distortions. Because that certainly will be complementary to high skill work and less for low skill work, and will increase earnings gaps based on human capital differences. Now, beyond that, can governments really shape the nature of technology? One suggestion that people have made is a simple kind of principle is, let's at least support small and medium scale enterprises. And be very intentional about that, because the technologies that small and innovative small enterprises tend to develop are more labor intensive, and they'll fit the factor endowments much better, and that there's actually quite a lot of innovation potential in this sector if it's done the right way. Then, of course, there's a lot of discussion now of the newer technologies. I think there's so much work to be done in labor economics about how even digitalization is actually affecting skill demand, which I haven't seen a lot of very good. It's hard to measure because digitalization is so pervasive and manifests in many ways. But then, of course, we have the robots where there's been a lot of work done, but now we have the ChatGPT, the AI, and that's going to go on. There's always going to be a new technology. And in fact, the nature of those changes are going to probably continue to accelerate. So we just need to start asking the right questions. We're really asking any questions in terms of collecting data to stay ahead of these trends. Let me stop there and thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you, Albert, for an engaging, perceptive, and sometimes puzzling lecture. We have a limited amount of time because Albert has a flight to catch, so we have about 15 minutes for Q&A. Let's try and make as efficient the use of it as we can. Let me take one question each from the three first, and maybe I'll do 3 questions. And
Sure,
I'll say, okay. I see. I think I saw that gentleman, Balwant, at the back first. Yeah. I see you, Rakesh. Yes, that gentleman.
Thank you very much. And it's a really nice presentation. I'm Balwant Mehta from Institute for Human Development. My question is, as you said in the beginning, there is a job polarization in developed countries due to this technological changes, which is also led to the job polarization, also led to the wage polarization, and even in inequality, rise in inequality in developed countries. And on the other hand, what you said in China, actually this middle jobs, the job polarization is not happening. And on the other hand, what you said, this wage inequality over the period is also, declining. So it's my question, if wage inequality, it's really happening in other countries, like in India, in case we also did some kind of study on the similar kind, what you just presented. So there is a question like whether it is because of only wage or is leading to the overall inequality. This wage inequality is leading to overall inequality or not. And the second question is whether this new technology, just because of these 2 reasons, or some capital deepening is happening or not, because that is also one of the factor which also leads to this overall inequality, even job polarization and all. So these are the 2 things which I want to know. Thank you very much.
Rakesh, we take 3 questions first. I'll and then come back for one more.
Yes.
Thank you. A couple of questions, basically on technology change, actually. It is said all the time that technology is changing very rapidly, right? At the same time, all the measurements of TFP are suggesting it has really slowed down in the last 20 years, 25 years. So that's a big puzzle, and in some sense, the consequences of that on labor use. And 2, again, you mentioned AI right at the end. All this kind of fear of AI, and particularly for developing countries. In India, we always pretend that we are American in terms of whatever is happening in America, we think is happening here. But do you really see a lot of impact of AI on the labor market, on the usage of routine tasks, or now non-routine tasks, actually?
Yes.
General from Dan Foundation and I have a very my question very I just wanted some elaboration. Yeah. I think what are the policy level implications? I think the presentation made by you is very exhaustive and it raises a lot of issues. So policy level implications for organizations like ADB, World Bank, or then moving further for the government, etc. You made some reference. Is there any more thinking on that? Yes.
Would you?
Yeah,
would you
well, I mean, I can,
please?
yeah, thanks. So thanks for the question. The first one is about how this wage inequality is related to overall inequality. I think they tend to be correlated, but obviously it depends on the dynamics of household composition, et cetera. One thing I find interesting that, despite everyone being alarmed that inequality is growing everywhere, actually there's been some progress in different places. If you believe, haven't seen estimates of overall inequality in India, but this decline in wage inequality is quite, especially from 2011 to 2017, is quite striking to me. And I've been working with some people on estimates for China that now span to a similar period in the 2010s. And also it looks like inequality started to decline gradually a bit in China, finally, after many years of growing. And we'd also know in Latin America, we've seen some declines in wage inequality, which most people have attributed to changes in education improvements and other things. So maybe it's not inevitable that inequality always increases. People like Thomas Piketty, show that the wealth inequality certainly seems to be increasing quite dramatically as well. And so, obviously policymakers still, the levels of inequality are still quite high. I mean, even if they're starting, not going up as fast. So it's still, of course, a great policy concern, given how all the ways in which inequality affects well-being, but also affects other dynamic processes in development. And so capital deepening, again, I think that is related to how it then manifests in wealth inequality over time. So the second question about technology is changing rapidly, but we're seeing a TFP slowdown in many countries. I think that's a very good question. In fact, I always poke fun at people who are looking at Chinese patent data. You see an explosion of Chinese patent, but it coincides, as you know, with a period of productivity slowdown. So, what are those patents really doing? So I don't have an easy answer. I guess it's a lot of issues about measurement, I would assume, about whether some of the embedded technology changes already being captured in the capital measures, et cetera, or not. But that's a challenge. And it's also, I think, related to the structural changes in the economy. We see much less industrialization now than we did before, and industry has always tended to be a higher TFP growth sector than services and agriculture. AI, is there evidence? I think Darren Ismuglu has an empirical paper looking at AI where they argue, I think it's suggestive and early, but they argue that it's different than automation and robots, that we don't see a very clear pattern of AI affecting the low-skilled workers differently than the high-skilled workers. But obviously that will evolve quite rapidly. And then the last question was just generally, I think, about policy implications. And I think we're talking about very major outcomes of inequality and changes in the nature of work. I was trying at the end of my talk to talk about very specific policy issues for governments to address. And I think when you say you should try to affect how technology evolves or technology is introduced into a country, I think because technology is changing so fast, there are so many opportunities. I think there is a rationale, and one thing we're doing at ADB is to try to support or stimulate technologies that will have high social benefits or be socially inclusive. Because in the early stage of development, there are a lot of constraints and nudges or financing or other types of support can actually shape the nature of breakthrough technologies. And so we have a financing vehicle, which is like a venture capital vehicle for promising green technologies that we try to invest in. I don't know how, it's probably too early to say how effective that will be. But that's one idea, and especially on social entrepreneurship, with things like even education technologies. There's so many ideas, so many things trying, but not enough study to figure out what really works, and then bringing money to scale up and disseminate those. And those will not always happen by themselves. So I think just by the market, because education is a public dominated sector. So I have all of these kind of ideas in my mind about what are policy implications for thinking about affecting technology. But there are a lot of economists who are just like they're hesitant to advocate for industrial policy. They're also hesitant to advocate for technology policies because they worry that it will just create less efficient innovation. And in the end of the day, it's kind of like picking winners, and you may waste a lot of money trying to create certain technologies that where much of it fails, and that it's better anyway. So I think I've heard both sides of these stories by very good economists. So it's not settled.
Thank you, Albert. We have 6 questions that have come from people listening to us online, and I'm going to put 3 of those to you.
Okay.
First, how do we account for the unpaid work of women, children, and family labor at home, on the farm, and in the firm? Second, COVID has changed the nature of work everywhere in the world, including China. What is your sense of how the routine nature of work may have changed with the impact of COVID-19? 3, is there any evidence of gender differences in these routine task intensity estimations?
Okay, I'm not sure. Well, unpaid work, if it's asked in the surveys, I think you can study the nature of if unpaid work is in a family business, and you can characterize what type of job it is. You can still study it in terms of the nature of work and whatnot, but of course it's harder to link to wages. And so there is this data challenge trying to link changes in nature of work to wages, because wage data is and income data is much less complete oftentimes, especially self-employment income, when a large share of the labor force is engaged in that type of work. But in principle, I think you should be able to study it, but we don't in these results, unfortunately. COVID and whether it affect routine or non-routine work, I haven't seen a study on it. I would say that because COVID really privileged kind of higher skilled work that you could do online, remotely, and was much more disruptive to in-person occupations, direct service occupations, obviously, that it would tend to have favored the non-routine jobs relative to the routine jobs. But I think more importantly, think about what happened, what was the result of COVID was the acceleration of digitalization in everywhere pretty much. And I think that is going to have longer term consequences for thinking about changes in the labor market. We are focusing, at ADB, there's a lot of discussion about digitalization and how we need to include digital opportunities in the design of projects across sectors. And the problem is a lot of senior people in places like the ADB are not the most tech savvy people, so they may not even be aware of so it's kind of a challenge to really know what's happening at the frontier and then understand the opportunities, because digitalization obviously has great opportunities for bridging distance gaps, being inclusive, but it also has a natural tendency to exclude many of the poor in terms of just access to the internet and whatnot. So it's kind of this very powerful double-edged technology, and that needs to be, I think, aggressively shaped and recognized by governments with very clear digitalization strategies. So that, I think, is going to be the most lasting legacy of COVID in terms of the nature of work. And then gender differences, I haven't seen analysis of routineness of work broken down by gender. I think we could do it actually, because we have the gender variable, but I think my colleague Piotr said he had done that once and didn't find huge differences in the patterns, but maybe we could go back to that. We've been thinking also about digitalization. Digitalization has had some benefits for women, like, well, obviously online work can being able to work remotely provides more work flexibility, which often is beneficial to women, but also some of the business process outsourcing sectors. The digital services trade is the fastest growing component of all trade, and countries like the Philippines and India, I think, have done very well on business processes. And there's been research in the Philippines, I'm aware, which has shown that this particular sector has been very friendly for women in terms of both employment growth, but also even promotion to managerial positions and whatnot is much better in this sector than in other sectors in the economy. But those are fairly still early anecdotal evidence.
Okay, just a question, not comments or observations. Yeah, these two, that's it. I'll have to draw it to a close after that.
Yeah, Professor Park, Indian society is a very heterogeneous society. We have different types of caste, class, and other factors. And post-liberalization, we had accessibility of education. And educated people, in comparison to uneducated, Manrega scheme is there, but educated people are not getting any type of protection from the government. And what's your analysis about it? Whether second is Corona, after Corona, do you think it has given a very huge difference between different types of classes? Like 80 crore people are getting free food from government, and other may be also left out. So how do you analyze with post-Corona analysis?
Yes, yes. My question is very brief regarding the larger gap that we are seeing in the recent past as far as oligopolies are concerned, monopolies are concerned, and small firms are concerned. For example, in India, we are seeing people in unorganized sector, for example, in tea plantation and textiles, etc. Which have very limited mobility. While in developed countries, firms are a lot more, automated. They are able to take the advantage of globalized supply chains and financial markets. So the gap is widening because of this, and there's a lot of social unrest. So what is your reaction to that? How do you foresee the future regarding it? Thanks very much.
Okay, so one is about gaps between groups in terms of growing inequality, I think, and how did COVID affect that? So actually, one of the big challenges of, because we've been very concerned about how the pandemic has affected poverty and inequality, but we've been very frustrated because during the pandemic, survey work stopped. So it's hard to get survey-based evidence. And so as a result, we were doing things like taking survey data from before the pandemic and then projecting growth rate changes into income changes, making fairly simple assumptions. People thought, I think, that the poor were being hurt more by COVID, but didn't have a lot of detailed microdata to really show the magnitude of that. In the last couple of years now, we're starting to see the survey data coming in, and we've been trying to look at that as it comes in. And it's handicapped by the fact that if you observe survey household incomes like last year or even this year, then you're not capturing the low point of the pandemic. So if there was a big shock and then a recovery, you may not see it. You may just see nothing happened, right? Because you're not measuring it as in real time as it goes. But it's still important and useful to do so because you want to know if there is recovery or not. So it's still worthwhile. And I think for that, and I think we've looked at survey data for maybe 10 countries and in Asia, and it's pretty mixed actually in terms of the inequality distribution. There's not an obvious increase in inequality. There definitely was an average income shock, and it differs across countries, but there's not, it's hard to generalize, which I guess is in some ways is good news that it's not as bad as we thought, at least not in a systematic way across all countries. But I think, you know, we continue to monitor that. But in terms of specific groups, I hesitate. I think that's going to be so specific to the circumstance of and institutions in each country. So maybe I'll have to just not really answer that directly. So the second question about small firms and unorganized sector and growing gaps again, I think, and you said it's causing social unrest. I'm curious to know more about that. But I spent a lot of time, again, focusing on small and medium firm development as a high priority. And I was also at the, you know, just yesterday, the day before, at the Think Tank 20 Summit event, where, you know, there's all this very vigorous discussion to come up with a communique with some recommendations for the G20. And there also came through quite a few recommendations to support small and medium enterprise development. And I think digitalization in particular has kind of a unique ability to promote SME development, but we're not there yet. And the reason I say that is digitalization solves a lot of fixed cost problems for a small firm. In terms of marketing, you don't need to have a store even, or places to, or a retail outlet. You can just do everything online. It saves a lot of fixed costs. It solves an information problem. You can get great information on if you're tapped in and know how to do it, and it solves a marketing problem because you can just sell online, right? So in principle, it could really help small firms. And it's also a new technology. So in most countries, there's still a lot of innovation space to come up with a new idea and then to execute it into something. But we also know that small firms, again, are less connected. Managers are less, they have less managerial ability, less understanding of the internet. So it's kind of like a training challenge or a mentoring challenge or an awareness challenge and an infrastructure challenge also to make it possible for these firms, even if they're located remotely, to be able to get good access to the internet. And then, so there's a lot of things that I think would need to happen. And the other, I think, potentially very high payoff return development for small and medium enterprises is international trade, right? Because for most small firms, it's unthinkable to export because there are a lot of fixed costs to exporting as well, in terms of just filling out paperwork, customs, you know, for most companies that would be unthinkable. But if digital services trade, which is now the subject of many international trade negotiations, how do we come up with standards? How do we harmonize standards? How do we move to paperless trade? If all of those things could work, and it could be more possible for small and medium firms to access international markets, that could also really promote a much more inclusive type of development path. But we're far from there, right? But I think people have to, you know, technology, as was said, is changing so fast. We have to imagine the future and move with some intention and some urgency to take advantage of the opportunities that we can visualize.
Thank you very much, Albert. I'll take a few minutes to bring this to close. And I want to reflect on what you said. The essence of your hypothesis is that the routine intensity of work has witnessed a secular decline in industrialized countries, in rich countries, and that the routine intensity of work in rich countries is significantly lower than it is in middle-income countries, and even the contrast with the low-income countries is even greater. Now, this is something that one would expect. It's intuitive, and you find evidence for it, just as your explanations of what might explain this are all intuitively plausible. A technical progress, which if you think of ICT and computers, enables you to relocate routine tasks elsewhere outside the country or replace them with robots inside the country. Yeah. Or if you think of globalization, it leads basically to a relocation of low-skilled tasks if you can fragment production processes. And if you think of it in terms of the relationship between international trade and factor mobility, if you are short of labor and you cannot import labor, what you do is you export capital and import labor-intensive goods, goods in which capital is embodied, labor is embodied. Now, essentially, if you think back in history, both these factors, technical progress and globalization, because globalization is not new, nor is technical progress. So if you go back, say, to the work of Arthur Lewis, The Evolution of the International Economic Order, you find that there is this unequal division of labor between countries in the industrial north and countries in the global south. It's just that its form and manifestation has changed, but that division of labor, asymmetry in the division of labor has remained. What puzzled me a little, that's why I use the word puzzled, and that might have puzzled you, was your story about the services sector. Because in terms of the data, it doesn't provide any real explanation. And yet, in many ways, that's where the heart of the problem is, Albert. Because it's not just in low-income countries or middle-income countries. Even in rich countries, the services sector is deeply dichotomized. So if you think of the United States, just think of the large proportion of the workforce that has seen no increase in real wages despite the tight labor markets today. And these are people who work in retail. These are people who work in restaurants. These are people who work for aggregators, or Amazon. These are people who drive Ubers. These are people who are in courier services. They're all doing routine tasks, the gig economy. And that's big in the US too, where there is, they are doing low routine intensity tasks. So that demand has not vanished from rich countries. That the demand for such labor exists. The intuitive sense I have is that it is met in the US by legal and illegal migrants from Hispanic America. Yeah, you just go anywhere, casual empiricism, construction work, retail work, delivery work, it's all been done by the immigrants. Just as in the European Union, the high-income countries rely on workers from lower-income EU countries, Poland, many others. And you can see the crisis in the UK because they don't have enough people for maintenance. They're out of the EU. So the services sector is a paradox that you need to think about. Why does it not provide an explanation? And who provides these services that citizens are not willing to provide? There are certain categories of work that citizens are not able or willing to do in rich countries. How is it being provided? Not by technology, because a lot of it is labor intensive. And two last observations. One is about what does this mean in terms of implications for learning? Because learning is a very important part of the evolution of economies. Now, Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations had a wonderful passage. Although he waxed eloquent about the virtues of the division of labor, he wrote that anyone performs the same task time and again that person will become as stupid and ignorant as it is possible for a human being to become. So that this kind of asymmetry in the division of labor has implications for learning in societies and economies. And the other thing, by the way, I find this steeply dropping wage inequality in India intuitively implausible. It doesn't square with any other evidence that we have seen. Now, the World Inequality Report of Thomas Piketty may be adventurous in terms of statistical use sometimes, but the evidence is quite devastating in India, everywhere else. The point is the data are not robust enough. They're filling in many gaps, but nevertheless, it's telling a story. And I think that this division of labor that you are analyzing has important implications, I believe, for economic inequality between countries, because that division of labor will produce a cumulative causation. Increasing returns don't come with routine tasks. They come with non-routine tasks. Economies of scale, both static and dynamic, come with that. I'm a little surprised that it's not showing up. China is actually, there was a question about it. China is a paradox, because you're finding that the middle wages are rising, and that may be moderating the inequality. Although if you look at macro numbers in China, inequality is now very high. India and China have possibly now amongst the highest inequality countries, much more unequal than Brazil and Malaysia, which were the classic examples of inequality. And, you can look at Piketty's work now, or even Atkinson. 2015, his book, where he says that the Gini coefficient in both China and India, he estimates at more than 50 for countries that had a Gini coefficient of less than 30, 40 years, less than 40 years ago. So these are two thoughts I want to leave you with. What does it mean for learning and inequality? And how do we explain this anomaly of the services sector? Because that is demanding labor that does routine tasks. And the gig economy is a classic.
Do you want me to respond, or are we ending?
Well, you can quickly if you want.
Just go ahead. I don't think the services sector are an anomaly, actually. I mean, I think there are also sectors where you see technology changing, computer use growing. I mentioned that some service sector jobs are increasing quite a lot, and some of them are routine. But that's more, I think, a reflection of structural change and demands as growing middle classes in rapidly growing countries have a much bigger increase for these types of services, and it creates a demand that fuels increases of the share of workers in the middle of the distribution. But I don't think it goes against any of the big forces that we're talking about, or against the nature of technology change. And there's some issues about how you classify different types of jobs into being routine or non-routine. It used to be you thought driving was irreplaceable because you needed someone who could, hand-eye, see what's going on the road. But now, of course, we know pretty soon drivers are going to be replaced. So that looks like a very routine or irreplaceable thing. People also said that, janitors and stuff who had to clean in different types of ways were a non-routine job. But now we have, as we know, machines that can do all of these things. And so technology also is changing in ways that, affect both low skill and high skilled workers. But I wouldn't equate everything. There's not a direct mapping between low skill and routine. That's what I would say. So some of the characterizations, I think, were a little bit like that. So, and then the other question about learning and
inequality,
the high levels of inequality. Yeah, I don't dispute that. I mean, I think my best estimate of Gini coefficients in China are also that are well above 0.5. But we've also seen in China a very fast increases in the returns to skill, which drove increase in inequality, but then it's flattened out and maybe falling. And we also see, even at high levels, wage inequality, income inequality, not just wage inequality, has become fairly steady and now starting to decline a bit. So I don't think it's all baked in. the Piketty numbers are very specific, and they don't even, I don't think report Gini. They use
don't.
percentile differences because they want to stay away from some of these measurement
Bottom 50.
controversies, and they make a lot of structural assumptions to tell the story. So, but I'm nothing wrong with the analysis, but for India, I don't know. I mean, I haven't seen. I also have seen estimates above 0.5 for India, but I don't know about in terms of changes in recent years. But it seems like a lot of even poverty estimates, nobody knows what poverty rates are because the data hasn't been released for a while, right?
Yeah.
So it's highly discussed.
Poverty estimates is a big mystery in India.
But if you don't know poverty, you don't know inequality either, right? I mean,
No, but
anyway, so but maybe we shouldn't
we
take
should
this.
continue this
Yeah.
discussion. Yeah. But
Thanks.
may I, on behalf of all of us, thank Albert very much for what has been a splendid lecture, stimulating, is going to leave us thinking about the division of labor that seems to be evolving. Thank you very much, Albert, and thank you for making the effort and finding the time to come here.
Thank all of you. It's been a lot of fun.
I would now invite Dr. Tanuka Endo to propose the final vote of thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Priyanka. So good evening, everyone. Just on our behalf, on the behalf of Institute for Human Development, it's my very pleasant task to propose a vote of thanks to all of you, to Professor Park for giving us his valuable time, and the people who have, spent a lot of hours organizing today's event. So before I go into individual names, I just want to express my personal gratitude to Professor Park, because it was an opportunity to listen to him. And we are, and this routine and non-routine tasks and this new lens that he discussed, that is extremely interesting. And I'm sure we'll have very, very good takeaways from today's lecture. And it will inform our policy discourse and research as well. And I express our appreciation again to Professor Park for agreeing to come and deliver this Silver Jubilee lecture for IHD. Now, our heartfelt gratitude and thanks to the chairperson of IHD, Professor Deepak Nair, for his continued guidance and also for agreeing to chair today's event at a very short notice. Now, some of the board members are here for our event, and I would really like to express my thanks and on the behalf of IHD. I think Professor Sudipta Mandal is here, who's a member of the IHD board and the chairman of the IHD Finance Committee. Professor Pulin Nayak, who happens to be my old professor also at Delhi School. So very nice meeting him. He's also the academic committee chairman. He's also here. Sincere thanks to all of them on behalf of IHD for providing guidance and helping in areas of research and dissemination. Now, the success of this event, it owes a great deal to our teams at IHD who have coordinated the communication, administration, logistics, and I must mention them. In this connection, I would like to first mention two individuals, Ms. Priyanka Tyagi, who has been instrumental in she's the CEO, and she has been instrumental in various aspects in organizing this event, and Ms. Jyoti Girish, who always ensures seamless logistics facilitation for all. A special thanks to both of them. And their commitment was well supported by the diligent team at IHD. These were Vikas, Aditi, Siddharth, Rekha, Arjun, Anisha, Bhavna, Siddharth, Subodh, Usman, Renu, Amarjit, and Sanjay. And let us really give them a big round of applause. I would also like to mention special appreciation for Azu Saifi for branding, as well as Nisar and Wahid for the website and Raja Films for their AV documentation. And our thanks to all the participants in this audience, because without you, all the events would lose their shine. So thanks for making it successful. And finally, I would like to express our deep gratitude to Professor Alakan Sharma, the director of IHD, who played a pivotal role as the architect of this event and indeed the entire series that is going on during the year. And as in the past, he has continued to guide and coordinate our efforts, resulting in yet another successful event. We are truly thankful, sir, for your contributions and guidance. And I'm very sorry in case I've missed out anybody in thanking. And I'll just like to hand over the mic to Priyanka. Priyanka, where are you? Yeah, just for closing. Thanks a lot.
So thank you everyone for joining. Thank you, Professor Park. Thank you, Professor Nair. Thank you, everyone. And as Professor Sharma said in the beginning, this is the Silver Jubilee year. Year-long activities are going on.